It's a Department of Commerce decision. And so the way I talk about that decision is what we did was we set up a huge unconsented public health experiment by pushing Alaskans west. And we know that Alaska has a very, very, very high suicide rate and high rates of unintentional injury and high rates of substance use. I suspect that just as we have seen in the lower 48, where the western edge of the time zone, your suicide risk increases, and it's very likely due to that sleep deprivation factor, I suspect that our displaced time zones have a distinct, clinically significant effect on mental health and suicide behaviors and injury behaviors and substance behaviors moving further west in the time zone.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Lisa Alexia. She is a psychiatric physician assistant in Anchorage specializing in eating disorders. Today, we talk about her entrance to the healthcare field as a community health aide in Nikolai, Alaska, her decision to go back to school to become a physician assistant, and the types of eating disorders that she's been seeing in Alaska. But the last half of our conversation is the reason why she is on this show. Back in May, she authored an editorial in the ADN calling for an end to daylight saving time in Alaska. PA Alexia has become a subject matter expert on circadian rhythms, time zones, and the mental health risks of sleep disruptions associated with time zone displacement, something that happened especially to Western Alaska in 1983 when Alaska consolidated 4 time zones into one. She will explain today that what's best for Alaskans' health would be to fall back and never spring forward again. Lisa Alexia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
I grew up in Sacramento, primarily, California, and I went to UC Santa Cruz to be with the Redwoods and get my bachelor's degree. And I graduated from there in 1991. I think in many ways my life began in college.
What'd you study?
Women's studies and psychology. And to graduate in 1991 with a degree in women's studies and psychology is to graduate with little more than a high school diploma in terms of my ability to support myself.
From UC Santa Cruz.
Psychology, yes.
Which is its own particular brand.
Yes, Redwoods.
Yes.
Yeah. So I decided to move to the woods, which was what I loved to do. And I lived in Minnesota for much of the 90s. I wandered through my 20s doing an assortment of odd jobs and seasonal things, and eventually married my first husband in Minnesota, and we ultimately moved to the middle of nowhere in the interior of Alaska, built a log cabin, and...
when we say the middle of nowhere, what was the nearest village or... Medfra.
Yeah. So, between Nikolai and McGrath.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So that's way out there.
Very, very, very remote. We landed in DC-3 in the middle of the lake.
Well, what was that experience like?
It was amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah.
And you built your own cabin. I mean, what did y'all do for money?
Well, that was the rub. That was one of the challenges for a variety of reasons. And ultimately, I didn't stay in that marriage. I ended up in the village of Nikolai, and I became a health aide and met my second husband and had 2 kids.
In Nikolai?
Yeah. And not in that order, but...
Yeah, you gave birth in Nikolai?
No, there's an amazing healthcare system at AMC, and my children are the beneficiaries of that. And so my pregnancy was taken care of very well through that system. I wouldn't have done it.
Did you deliver in Anchorage?
Yeah, I delivered in Anchorage. Yeah. Ultimately, my, women's studies and psychology degree started to be professionally useful in my role as a community health practitioner in Nikolai. I could see every day the way that what I had learned in college was relevant to so many things that I saw, and not just about gender, but also about culture and about the way different cultures interact and structures and powers.
Can you talk about like a specific example of a particular person you met and how those issues played out in front of you?
I think it would be very difficult to do that.
Right.
Very small stuff.
That's true.
And I don't think I can do that.
I was thinking it was far enough back that maybe you could.
No.
Yeah. Well, then I guess not a specific person, but what's an example of a type of situation that you would see where you would have that knowledge would play a role.
Let's move forward, and I think it'll be easier moving
Perfect.
forward.
I don't want to leave remote, small Alaska too fast.
Okay.
What sorts of challenges do folks face there that you may not see in more urban parts of Alaska?
Yes. So I think anybody who's lived in rural Alaska knows you have to have plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to Z and double A, double B. That's kind of built into it. I think most Alaskans understand that, but triplify that for the villages. So,
like in terms of planning that you're going to be somewhere on a certain date or time.
When my second husband built a house for us, he had to coordinate with Spinards and the barge, and some things had to be flown in. And as you know, for any contractor in Anchorage, it's challenging to get all the parts and pieces lined up and there in time in order to get something done. He did that for the village, in the village, had that house built. We moved in 3 weeks ahead of my due date, which was good because I had to come into town 2 weeks ahead of my due date, or ahead of when I was anticipated to have to come into town.
So you basically had a week to set things up in the new house.
He was 3 weeks ahead of schedule. And I just found that absolutely amazing. But that's the kind of planning that you
living there required.
And people don't get that, right? Like healthcare providers, a doctor comes in and they have their very narrow urban training.
Yeah.
They are not equipped to run a rural clinic. You have to do everything from making sure the floor is swept and mopped periodically to triaging decisions. And as a health aide, you're not supposed to be making decisions. But the reality is, if you can't get a hold of the right person at the right time, sometimes you do. Sometimes,
well, and can it, for folks who may not know, what is a health aide?
Yes. So a community health aide / practitioner is a very uniquely Alaskan profession to provide primary care in the villages of Alaska. It originated in response to the tuberculosis epidemic. Individuals that came into town for treatment ended up being trained to provide directly observed therapy in order to help treat folks back home who had tuberculosis.
And directly observed therapy means that someone watches you take your pills
every day.
And that this is something that's important because if you miss your pills, you're not being adequately treated, you're potentially more contagious. Like there's reasons why.
And you could potentially increase the risk of developing a drug-resistant form of TB.
And yes, and it's spreading that drug-resistant form of TB, and then future people contracting that version of tuberculosis, which will not respond to the pills.
Which we're dealing with now.
Yes.
Yeah. I think I'd always thought about medicine, but I didn't have the patience for chemistry, and I had too many other interests. And every time I thought about it, it felt too late financially and time-wise. And I'm not a very patient person. So
were you in your 30s when you became a health aide?
Yeah. So it was like a second chance in so many ways to enter the healthcare profession. I was on call 24/7. I mean, it's an in the trenches job, but I learned so much.
And did somebody say, hey, they're looking for a health aide? Or how did you decide to become a health aide?
A whole lot of things. When I left Morrison Lake and moved to the booming metropolis of Nikolai of 100 people, it was there. I had known it was there. I realized, as we do in our 20s and 30s, like when reality hits, you just go, whoa. I realized that I wanted children, and it was not going to happen in that remote location with that first husband. And for a variety of reasons, some of them financial. And I also realized that I wanted more out of career. I had not really wanted that before. And so it intrigued me and it interested me and it was open. And I had a little bit of experience in healthcare field. I'd had an internship. So it appealed to me and I applied and they said, yeah.
Got it.
So
do you have any memorable experiences? What I assume is that health aides have a certain scope of the things that they're supposed to deal with. But then, of course, because they're the only person in this remote place, they inevitably find themselves in situations where they are asked to do things that are beyond that scope. Do you have any examples of that?
I remember the first time I was asked to lance an abscess, lance a boil, and the elder was like, I am not going to McGrath. you, Dr. Lisa, are going to do this. And I think I had seen it done. Like I always sought out as much experiences and opportunities and to watch things in the ER when I was in town for training. I mean, over and above and beyond, just because I didn't want to do something first time without having seen it. And I might have seen this before, but I was terrified. I'm like,
did you come to Anchorage for training?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But, I called and got the directions to do so, medical direction to do so. And he's like, no, you're doing it. I'm not going to McGrath. So we did, and however imperfect it was, he was very appreciative that I handled it for him there in the village without having to make him travel. And we did follow-ups every day. And so that's a small thing. But as a health aide, when you're trying to do a procedure on someone and you don't know all the anatomy and physiology and risks and all the factors that go into it, it's terrifying.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah. How long were you a health aide, and at what point did you decide I want to go back to school and go further?
Yeah. I first became a health aide, I think in the fall of 2001. I started my training and progressed to CHP over the next 2-3 years of training.
What's CHP?
The full certification.
Got it. So you start kind of doing the job early on, but you're advancing with certifications.
Yeah. So when I was there, it was like a month, 3 to 4 weeks of training in town. The first 2 is ideally right away in the first year or so, and even the third one. So I think I did the first 3 sessions within the first year or so. And then it took me a while. I had a child. I had a break in service before I went to session 4, and then the preceptorship. I also had 2 kids. And so I took a break in service because I was the only one.
You were in Nikolai this whole time?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a small period of time where we went to California because I was thinking of it. There was no MedEx program, so I was going to try to establish residency there. So it broke my heart to break Alaska residency for even that 6 months, but I did. But ultimately, so that was around 2007, 2008. There were things happening in the community that I realized I needed a way to support myself and the kids and the family that wasn't relying on being in a really small village. Because what happens is there are so many needs in a small village, and people who come in with a certain amount of education get called on to do a lot of things. And there are definitely a lot of talented people in the village. But I think, one way to put it is, if you take a village of 100 people, which by and large Nikolai was, and you're trying to run a city council, a village council, all the infrastructure, the school, everything, most of that needs to be done by locals. And it is hard to find, just talking about governance, it's hard to find 14 people to run those 2 councils that can hear, that have integrity, that are of appropriate age, that have excellent cognitive function, that can understand the things that are being presented to them and make appropriate decisions. And, those are external structures that have been imposed by the world, so to speak, through ANGSA and all the other things. And there were a lot of challenges going on. And as I got pulled into some of the deeper infrastructure challenges, we had a sewer system that was failing. We had a generator system that was failing. There were some significant gaps in what needed to happen for the community. And I was getting pulled in more and more. And I just hit the limit of what I could do. And ultimately, I went to my then husband and said, I think I'd like to go to PA school so that we have an opportunity to let the kids grow up somewhere where I'm not quite so stressed out. I mean, that was part of it.
And had you always known what a physician assistant was?
That's a good question. So yes, when I was in Santa Cruz in my first and second year of college there, I did an internship at the Women's Health Center as a medical assistant doing women's health, a lot of education around contraceptives and birth control. Fantastic internship, and there was a PA there. So I knew of the profession. I did not really understand that this was something that made sense for me. And I wish I had, but I didn't. And, I say that, but I love the life that I've had.
Well, I went to PA school in my mid-30s.
Yes.
Because I felt like if I had been an undergrad, I would have gone to medical school. But because I was approaching a career in medicine, at the time I felt like 35 was an old student. I don't feel that way at 50, but I did then.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I'm going to be a PA because I'm, 12 years behind. Right. And so I need to go this route. Right. But we see folks who go straight from undergrad into PA school. So it's not necessarily about doing this as an older student.
Yeah. Yeah, I think certainly for me it was. It's somewhere along the line. I read some research that said for women who very often are taking time out of their careers to have children, that the financial equation is better for them to be PAs.
Right.
I mean, there are multiple reasons to make the decision one way or the other, but really that made sense to me. And for me, looking at the whole picture, I had 2 kids. I was already maxed out. I actually did there in my early 40s think about, do I want to just go back and go do the whole hog, which at that point I would have had to do prereq. So it would have been 10 years, right?
Right.
Or do I want to do the PA school? And I had, a lot of wonderful people sort of talk me through this.
And did you go to MedX?
Yes, I did.
You did.
We went to Sacramento thinking that I would try to go to UC Davis. And at the time, they didn't have the MedX program. I checked right before I left. But we went in the fall. By January, we were all terribly homesick. And I called, and they were launching class 1 and some other very specific problems that were going on back home were resolving. Including the fact that I was going to have my dream coworker for the first time. I had been recruiting her, probably since she was 18 years old. And she was, by then in her mid-20s and pregnant. But she was fantastic. And so I got to mentor her to be a health aide. So I wasn't going to be alone.
Right.
And that was
for the first time ever.
Right. For the first time ever.
Really briefly, how do you define what a physician assistant is?
I'm a trained medical provider in primary care. I can work with any doc and work within their scope. I like that it is so incredibly flexible that if I decide I'm not interested in my specialty, I could theoretically find another doc and work with them, switch specialties. I haven't wanted to do that. I really, really like the working with docs and the mentorship. I think what I didn't know and understand until being in this profession, maybe even just in the last few years, is the training as a medical provider is just the beginning. And most of what you learn is on the job and with mentorship. Mm-hmm. And it's not that the mentor is standing there right by you, but that they're available and they can talk to you and they can help buoy you up when you are just flailing and totally uncertain that you ever want to do this again. Mm-hmm. And it is... Yeah.
I appreciate that. The thing that I often say, though, is like any medical provider, whether you be an MD, a DO, a nurse practitioner, or a PA, no one enters this profession knowing everything they're going to need to know for their career. It is a constant state of learning. Yeah. And so I feel like built into our name and built into the way we were designed, that we're always asking questions and seeking advice. But really, that doesn't make us different. No one has all the answers. And so I think in a way we are more primed to ask questions. Yeah. And I think that's a positive and not a negative.
Oh, yeah. I feel like it fits me really well. Fast forward to where I am now. I'm in psychiatry. And my background in Northern California with the women's studies and psychology and so many other things growing up in Northern California, I feel like I have found a niche that integrates a lot of other things in a unique sort of way where I am able to provide a good service to people that's safe and careful. And I think that's one thing that PAs can do that is different than docs and maybe different than nurse practitioners is we can bring a lifetime of other kinds of unique experiences to the specialty we choose, as well as life experiences which may reflect different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think that provides an important point of connection for some patients that we see.
And I guess so you were in the first class at MedX? Or you second?
2.
You were class 2. And for folks who don't know, explain what the MedX program is.
So University of Washington WWAMI program has as part of its medical school, the MedX, I don't know what it stands for, but it's 2 years and some change.
So it's basically a physician assistant program loosely associated with WWAMI, which people are more familiar with. But you were able to go to PA school in Alaska.
Yes. And that was really ended up being key for our family. So it was going to be a bridge too far for our family who the father is from a small village for us to be in Sacramento. It got to the point where I realized that was just not going to work. So it was very, very difficult for me to be in Anchorage and the kids to go back and forth and their father to be in Nikolai. And ultimately did all end up in Anchorage. But we're still connected to a lot of the life.
Got it. And you explained that PA training is largely geared towards primary care. We all do rotations in multiple different specialties. And so we're all familiar with other specialties, but sort of the core is that you could come out and be a primary care physician assistant. Did you go straight into psychiatry?
Well, yes and no. The very first assignment, I was in the itinerant pool. So I had good relationships at SCF, ANMC. They had mentored me throughout as a health aide. And so I was able to transition pretty seamlessly from a rural itinerant health aide that I had done while I was in training on vacations to a rural itinerant PA.
So talk about what the itinerant, what does that mean?
So for South Central Foundation's Rural Anchorage Service Unit, an itinerant pool of nurse practitioners, PAs, and community health practitioners will go out to their remote villages.
That don't have anybody.
That maybe they need relief or they're just inadequately staffed. So St. Paul, Dalton, Iliamna, San Pedro Bay. There are a number of villages that I'm forgetting them right now.
But that are not adequately staffed. And so if the person were to go on vacation or to have surgery, there would be no one in that village.
And not all the rural villages are served through a tribal health organization, but the South Central Foundation villages are served through RASU, the Rural Anchorage Service Unit, and some of the other tribal health organizations also have itinerant pools. So there can be cooperative agreements. So I did some of that, and my very first PA assignment was in McGrath in January of 2012, I think. And then I think it was in February, I began working at South Central Foundation's Fireweed, which is outpatient community mental health.
So your first sort of full-time job was in mental health?
Yes, absolutely. So 5 years of that.
And it makes sense because you did psychology as an undergrad, so it just kind of felt like a natural fit.
Yeah.
And you stayed there. So it's obviously been a good fit.
Yeah, I ended up making a transition period. I went back into the itinerant pool for a period of a few years and just did that. My kids said I was a lot less stressed out, but it was a mixed bag because being in the village and being on call and some of those flights were pretty stressful. But when I was home, I was able to be much more present. Having juggled becoming a PA and trying to parent. And a lot of that was single parenting, not all of it.
Because you're no longer with your second husband.
Correct. And he's helped out and contributed, but it's been a juggle. And I would say I'm really, really glad I didn't try to go to the MD route. I don't think any of us would still have our sanity. There's just no way. It has been extremely challenging. And something that was said to me when I was trying to weigh that equation really has stayed with me, which is, the school is one thing, but that first few years in the job is another. You should expect that to be very time consuming, more than 40 hours a week, and a lot of emotional and mental drain as you're trying to really get the hang of this thing.
I mean, I think that people often think of becoming a PA as being the easier route, but the first few years as a PA is your residency. It is very stressful because you are seeing patients. Their healthcare is dependent upon you and the decisions that you're making. And it is a big weight to suddenly be carrying, and you're carrying it much more quickly than if you'd gone the medical school route.
And I think one of the things that we constantly have to self-advocate for is that lead-in time, that gentle transition, that mentorship. And, both my collaborative and myself advocated fiercely to make sure that I had the time to learn what I needed to do it well.
Right.
And I am very, very grateful.
So you were working in mental health, and you're still working in mental health. Yeah. And I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing today, what your practice is like?
Yeah. So this makes it easier to sort of weave back to my first degree. So I've been doing mental health, and I feel like I'm integrating an enormous amount of what I learned growing up in my home and my family and my community and at UC Santa Cruz It would be strange to call myself a feminist psychotherapist, but in a sense that gets incorporated in everything I do. What that looks like is, I work with individuals with eating disorders. I work with women who are pregnant or nursing or reproductive transitions, or that they're having mental health issues that they feel are related to their condition as female, whether it's premenstrual dysphoric syndrome, and really working at let me be a go-to person for this. And fortunately, I am not the only one with reproductive psychiatry and reproductive mental health. There's a growing pool of providers in Alaska and nationwide who are good with this. But in terms of psychiatry and eating disorders and understanding both the medical and the mental health manifestations of that and what meds might be helpful or not, there are not a lot of people in the state that do that for eating disorders. And so I've really enjoyed that. And it does tie back to work I did in a women's studies program working with women on body image issues, which is quite the nexus of culture and medicine and psychology. And it's an intersection.
And I'm confessing my ignorance, but do we have a lot of folks with eating disorders in Alaska?
A lot came up during COVID. So yes, and it's one of those things, if you don't look for it, you don't find it. So I don't know if you were at the presentation that we gave. We had a panel presentation at the recent PA conference for this. And one of my colleagues had presented a slide basically saying, they said we didn't have it, but when we looked, maybe a third. In terms of...
And are we talking about anorexia, bulimia?
So if you think about it interestingly, so the anorexia and bulimia diagnoses make a lot of sense for a certain subset of the population. But if you look at disordered eating more broadly, it shows up in a lot of different ways. So how do we diagnose a situation where someone has access to food stamps and food at the beginning of the month, very limited food budget, trying to make sure they get dense calories for that period of time? Once they eat it, it's gone. So, and they're probably pretty hungry. That's an extreme example, but there's some disordered eating going on, but there's a socioeconomic
It's circumstances.
reason. Right. Well, what happens if a person grows up in that kind of very restricted food environment? There's feast or famine. Maybe they go back and forth and, one parent has resources and the other doesn't. And so there can be a lot of reasons for children to have intermittent access to food. And so that sets up for some crazy eating habits as well. And so what happens when an individual with those circumstances grows up and then they have a different kind of relationship with food than one that knows that, it's there and available?
So I'm hearing that perhaps you also deal with people who just overeaters. I mean, you know what I mean? Because if you grew up in a sort of famine-like state where, food is scarce and when you have it, you better eat it. I think that could actually lead to some disordered eating that's the opposite of anorexia.
It could, and it's complicated. It's complicated, and that's why the diagnostic monikers that we have really don't cover what goes on. And then the added sociocultural, and the medical profession is guilty of this too, overvaluing thinness, overlooking of the medical risks of being too thin. So for example, if you look at where longevity falls on a BMI chart, it falls to those who are overweight. So I think that's the clearest and simplest
Right. So
way to
overweight
explain.
is like BMI between 25 and 30. So actually being a little bit above the ideal weight is actually a healthier place to be.
It is certainly.
In terms of longevity.
In terms of longevity, that's where folks are. So there are biological changes that all our bodies go through throughout our lives that we may not fully understand. There may be a weight bump that happens in puberty. There may be a weight bump that happens in the early 20s. And that may not be exactly right. These are just things we don't fully understand, these different kinds of trajectories that go on. There may be a weight bump that happens with menopause. We just fight it. We just think our bodies should look a certain way. What is that about? What do our bodies need? And having some respect for the lived experience in our body with all the facts and circumstances of our lives, I think needs to be a much higher priority than just simply saying to somebody, oh, you need to lose 10 pounds. That doesn't help.
So I don't want to go off on this tangent, but I'll just bring it up because it might apply. I just watched the documentary on Netflix about The Biggest Loser television show. And what they did is followed up with some of these contestants who lost, some of them 200 pounds in 6 months to win a game show. And many of them have gained the weight back and then some. And very interesting study on these folks who lost this massive amount of weight and how they actually slowed their metabolisms down permanently
Yeah.
by doing these crazy, extreme low calorie diets with 8 hours of exercise every day in order to win a prize. And ultimately, it's going to adversely affect them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. When you restrict calories, your body slows down. Caveman, it's a hibernation, right? And so the body is responding to that message that there's not enough food. And so it is going to conserve calories. So you have just taught your body that there's this feast or famine cycle. And so every time you go for a diet, you repeat that. So it absolutely has consequences. And, I've read some studies that talk about, well, maybe obesity has some metabolic impacts, but are we sure it's that? Because also the diet cycle itself has cardiometabolic consequences. So I don't know if we fully teased out the difference between dieting and mild obesity.
And this is probably outside the scope of our conversation today, but I feel like GLP-1s, Saxenda, Ozempic, Wegovy, we have these new medications on the market that seem to be helping folks who've been obese to take control of their weight. And I don't know if you have a comment.
I mean, that could be a whole nother hour, but definitely spend a lot of time thinking about it and reading it, researching it. I think they're really fascinating medicines that have hit a particular cultural point in time. And I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies are making money hand over fist. I don't think they are all bad. I think that their use for losing weight is, it's not something that I am an advocate for, just because I have a lot of concerns, and it does increase the risk for disordered eating and severe disordered eating, as in anorexia nervosa can occur in a larger class body, and that's called atypical anorexia nervosa. So I don't think that's something that most healthcare providers prescribing GLP-1s are really well trained for.
So bottom line is that the fear is that some primary care might be prescribing these as a potential aid for weight loss without properly screening for potential eating disorders.
During and after. Yeah. So what I like to talk to people about is, what is your body saying about whether you have enough nourishment? Is your blood pressure within a reasonable normal range, not under 100 systolic, right? Is your pulse within range, like 60 to 100, not a resting pulse of 55 that jumps up to 80 when you walk across the room because you just don't have any cardiac reserves? Are you waking up in the night with night terrors because you're having a hypoglycemia? Are you having episodes of passing out because you're having hypoglycemia? These are indicators that your body's undernourished, and they get missed a lot. Looking at the overall health picture and just kind of, I think.
I'll be honest, like I followed on social media. I kind of went to like the hashtag Ozempic body and that kind of stuff. And there were people talking about the nausea, the vomiting, and how in the end it's all worth it. You know what I'm saying? Like that there is that kind of mentality that's like, oh, I feel like crap, but I've lost a lot of weight.
And so where as a culture have we put so much value on body weight, shape, and size? It's a cultural piece, right? It has gone beyond just medicine and health because people are focusing on it in terms of cosmetics, and they're missing all the things that they're doing to their body that are harming it along the way. So if there's any message I want to help to give people who are in my office, it's how can we better value our body and its signals? Because your body will very often tell you what it truly needs. And there's a difference between what your body wants and what it needs. A lot of times they're the same, not always, but like, how do we suss that out? So if we think of eating disorders as a metabolic syndrome of sorts, where you can have someone who's very skinny and has PCOS and has wild glycemic swings, and
polycystic ovarian syndrome.
So it's just essentially a blood sugar insulin relationship is very often the case. So you can have people who benefit from GLP-1s to help regulate that appetitive blood sugar swings and not have them lose weight, and they benefit from it. But you have to be really, really careful and mindful that if you're giving someone a GLP-1 and they're losing weight and their pulse is going below 50 and their energy is dropping and they're super constipated and their systolic blood pressure is below 100, you might set aside the BMI chart and look at their vital signs. They've gone into hibernation, and that may not be.
Well, and I've always wondered about this too, is that what you said about like fatigue. To me, if you're taking a medication that makes you feel so ill that you had been exercising and you've opted not to exercise, maybe that's not the right medication for you.
Right, like muscle loss.
Yeah,
right?
like
Because
you're not exercising because you feel nauseous. You just want to like lay there. And I've heard that from folks who've started these GLP-1. And I get it. Some people have very little side effects. They feel great. They're just eating a little bit less and they're having these great results and they are exercising.
Right.
But for some folks, it's not.
Yeah. And you want to be able to maintain that muscle mass. It's a really important thing. I think that conversation starting to come out more too is, you lose too much weight, you lose muscle mass. I've seen it. I've watched it. I'm like, hey, you're getting a little thin there. I'm like, what happened to your muscles, right?
Right.
Just, not patients, but just, people in the community that are friends that I can say that to, right? Yeah, I don't prescribe them. I'm aware of them. And I try to talk with people through sort of the conversation. And it's, I want to learn from my patient. I would rather they tell me that they're on them and say, hey, let's explore that together, because there's an emotional piece to this too, a psychological piece.
So transitioning to like the reason for this interview today, you wrote an op-ed about daylight saving time. As far as I know, the only healthcare provider who's weighed in publicly on the debate about daylight saving time. I'll just say that it's an interesting phenomenon as an elected official that there are so many things happening politics-wise, but this is an issue that some folks are very passionate about.
Yeah.
This is their issue. They either want Alaska to get rid of daylight saving time or to move to daylight saving time permanently. And we have examples of both bills currently in the Alaska State House. And so I guess, can you start off by telling us how you got interested in this and where you fall on that?
Sure. So when I lived in that very remote location that I first landed, one of the first things I noticed, we got there in March, but by May, things were leaping out and we were out doing different things, voting and up and down the.
So this is when you're in Medfra?
So we're voting to spring camp or whatever, and we're coming back at 11:30 at night, and it's dusky, but as you know, sunsets take a long time, but there's still a lot of light. And I'm like, we are really far south of the Arctic Circle. We should not have any period of no night, and it's only May. Why is that? And my first husband was good with geography, and he pulled out a sundial and showed me that we were very much off by the sundial. And so what that means is that midnight by the sun and midnight by the clock are displaced by a lot. And that has nothing to do with how far north we are and everything to do with time zones and how they are laid out. And so those are geopolitical decisions.
Right. And I guess for folks to understand that Alaska used to have multiple time zones. But
so in
I believe
1983,
under Governor Sheffield,
okay,
we went to a unified time.
Yes, we went from 4 time zones to 2, and essentially we function on 1. I think it's just west, maybe 8.
Exactly. The very far western Aleutian chain.
And so this is a visual.
Yes.
So this is kind of how we are. So if you look at this map that I'm showing, Andrew, essentially the only part of Alaska that is really aligned with the sundial is southeast. And so it would make sense that a lot of the proposals for a time zone change to permanent daylight time would come from southeast because it would not be a big deal there. Why it matters so much for the rest of us is that we are already pushed far into other time zone areas, and permanent daylight saving time would increase the displacement from the sundial. So I've got some other chart numbers here. So years later, I'm working with my kid on a science project with a homeschool situation. It's better sleep for kids. The whole start school later. They wanted to do a science project. The teacher involved said, let's do something Alaska-based. I said, well, what about this? I wonder if this is a factor. And they jumped on it. And so what we found out is that the school start times throughout Alaska do not take into account the fact that the sun doesn't come up until several hours beyond when it does in the lower 48. And all of that's because of the time zones that have collapsed. Occasionally, you'll find a school district that does that a little bit, but for the most part, they don't. And so interestingly, when the American Association of Pediatrics started really promoting this, like start school later, no school should start earlier than 8:30, they came out with a study and they said, oh, gee, Alaska has the latest start school times in the nation. They're fine. But that did not reflect the geopolitical time zone boundaries in Alaska. So again, it's an interdisciplinary problem because you've got medical providers focused on medicine and the clock, but this is a geography issue. And so actually, when we sat down and we broke it down, Alaska's got some of the earliest school start times in the nation if you look at it by the sun.
Right.
And absolutely, the clock doesn't matter. What matters is what time the sunrise is. Because
Right.
your body needs morning light. Morning light sets your circadian rhythm. It tells your body, okay, it's time to wake up. It's time to exercise. It's time to eat. It's time to go about our day. It's an entire symphony chorus that goes on in your body when the sun comes up. And if you go down and visit in the lower 48 in the winter or the summer, I'm sure you have felt this. The sun rises and all of a sudden you're awake. And it just feels so different than in Alaska where we're getting up at the middle of the night.
This is a fascinating chart.
This is an unpublished chart from the paper that these kids wrote. I
Oh, okay.
don't mind shouting out their names, but they were junior high school students at the time.
You know what I'll do? I'm just going to read some of them off. So
Yes. let's do that.
essentially, solar noon. So by the sundial,
Yes.
solar noon should be happening at 12 p.m.
Yeah.
Correct? At St. Paul Island, solar noon is happening at 3:05 p.m., which means that their schools are currently starting by the sun at 4:55 a.m.
Yes.
by the sun.
Yes.
And Savunga, solar noon at 3:06 p.m. School start time 5:54 a.m. You know, like these are some of the things that you're seeing just because of these. Gamble, which is like right next to Savunga, 3:10 p.m. is the solar noon. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
You have, whereas when you get down into southeast, Metlakatla, 12:30 p.m., that's much closer to noon. Kakatab, 1:03 p.m. It's an hour off.
Yeah.
So even these places that we consider sort of being the southeast and like that's not as bad,
It's still.
it's still an adjustment.
Yeah. So why?
Bethel,
Yeah.
I just want to say that because that's a big population center, 2:31 p.m. when, you know, it says 2.5 hours off from when noon should be.
Yes.
And that makes their school start time at 6:09 a.m. That's very early.
Yes.
I'm going to say Anchorage, since that's where most of us are. Anchorage, the solar noon is happening at 1:43 p.m. on average. And that makes a school start time of 6:32 a.m. as being the average school start time when our solar noon is this much late.
So why this matters is the increasing scientific evidence basis for circadian rhythms as governing lots about how our bodies function, and that disruption of them increases risk for lots of chronic health and more crisis health issues, including mental health issues. The motivations that I had coming out of supporting my kids in this science project was, what can we do to improve this in Alaska? Later school start times and a move towards permanent standard time were two goals that I had coming out of learning what I learned out of this project that seemed doable and helpful. Not enough, not going to fix everything, but doable and helpful. And so since that time, what we have achieved is in Anchorage, we do have a later start time, particularly for the teens who also have a later shifted biological clock. And so now we're getting into talking about the circadian rhythms and why all of this matters. So the Start School Later movement, it emphasizes that high school students biologically wake up later, go to bed later, wake up later. This is just biology. This is cross culture, cross nation. It's just, they figured this out. And they do.
And I think people know that instinctively.
Well,
you
if you
know,
think about it.
if you have kids that are teens,
Right.
then they are sleeping till 11 in the morning on Saturday.
But we psychologize it and we think there's something wrong with it. But this is biology, right?
Mhm.
I think that's what I do in a lot of stuff with my work is help to educate you. This is your body. This is your body's rhythm. How can we respond to your body's rhythm and move away from somebody else is telling you exactly what you should do and what you should look like and how you should behave and how your clock should be? And you can probably pick up that theme
Right.
in my
And your
work.
body's rhythm is responding to daylight.
Yes. And so when you override that, when you get up in the middle of your body's night, if you are if you're a professional going out to St. Paul Island to work in the school or in the clinic, you will feel this. You will absolutely feel this. People are there at 8 o'clock in the morning, rubbing their eyes, downing the coffee.
Because it's really 4 in the morning.
It's 4 in the morning. And so we have woken up at 3 in the morning to get there. It is brutal. And so imagine how you feel when you are tired. How do you function? Right? And so we have, as a state, we have said to villages, to Alaskans that, oh my goodness, we've got all these mental health problems. What do they do to? And, all this substance use and all these accidents and unintentional injuries. So what are the factors that contribute? Sleep deprivation is huge.
Alaska with Alaska time zone for 1983 and in Sheffield. So what I want to know is what the debates were in committee. Were they talking about potential health effects? Because I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, I bet they were talking about how it would help the business community. This
Yes.
was a business decision,
Yes.
not a health decision.
Absolutely. It's a Department of Commerce decision. And so the way I talk about that decision is what we did was we set up a huge unconsented public health experiment by pushing Alaskans west. And the conversation around subsistence communities and Western Alaskan communities was, again, it was alignment with economics. So whatever input was given, I went through the federal register.
And it's a much smaller population. They carry less voting power. They carry less consideration, period.
And less consideration would be given to their voice, period. That's the reality back then and still, right?
So
yeah.
Can you say that again? The experiment part
This
we
has
embarked
been
on?
a large, unconsented public health experiment to monkey with the time zone. So, for example, in the 70s, the nation did try permanent daylight time for a period of time, and it was quickly reverted. Now, at the time, it was a specific thing with the school buses, and that might not be the same issue today.
Because they're having to do so much work in the dark in the morning.
Well, kids getting on buses and getting hit.
Yeah, because it was dark.
And while that issue may not be the same issue today, we have a lot more evidence that these are very specific harms. So we know that Alaska has very dark late mornings. We know that circadian rhythm affects the time at which bodies wake up and function. So in this state, most people have a circadian rhythm sleep disorder or shift work type where they're getting up earlier than their body wants to in order to accommodate work needs. So we know that that's a factor. We know that circadian rhythm disorders have impacts on metabolic health and mental health, and
Traffic accidents,
unintentional injuries, substance behaviors.
And you just said cancer, and I cut you off.
Yes, cancer.
So there's an association with cancer?
Yes. We know that if you look in the lower 48, there's been some studies that show that if you live in the western edge of the time zone, you have an increased risk for some of these things, including suicide.
And
Right?
because I think that's an important thing to say, that this isn't, although Alaska's sort of this issue on steroids, if you, for example, I did my rural medicine rotation in Fort Stockton, Texas, which your time zone changes in New Mexico. You go to Mountain Time, but Fort Stockton's very close to Mountain Time, but it's still on Central Time. So it's sort of the western edge. And I remember being there and being like, why is it still light outside? So people in lower 48s can experience this on a smaller level if you live on
the western
edge of a time zone.
So the circle here, though, that I want to draw is, while the research that I would love to see done in Alaska, right? So we know circadian rhythm has these effects and mental health effects, and we know that we have a sleep-deprived population. Alaskans are sleep-deprived based on just the geography that we've talked about, and we know that that can have mental health effects. And we know that Alaska has a very, very, very high suicide rate and high rates of unintentional injury and high rates of substance use. And we know that there's a latitude effect because that's been studied by the Department of Public Health. I actually spoke with that epidemiologist a few years ago, and I said, can we look at the western part? That's something I'd like to look at. I suspect that just as we have seen in the lower 48, where the western edge of the time zone, your suicide risk increases, and it's very likely due to that sleep deprivation factor, I suspect that our displaced time zones, that if you were really able to look at that they have a distinct, statistically and clinically significant effect on mental health and suicide behaviors and injury behaviors and substance behaviors moving further west in the time zone. There are so many factors involved in it, but the evidence that I've read suggests to me that this time zone issue and the sleep deprivation associated with getting up in the middle of the night to go to school and work, because the entire communities revolve around schools, that this is one that hasn't been looked at. And honestly, anything we can do to help with that should better public health for Alaskans. And I would think improve student school performance as well. And dang, that's an economic.
Yeah. Well, and
benefit.
and what's interesting is that since Alaska used to have 4 time zones, there is comparisons that could be made. Do we have more suicide, accidents, etc., than we did when we had 4 time zones? Like, we can compare the numbers, per
Yeah.
capita.
Yeah.
Do we have more?
Yeah. And arguably, this is difficult to sort of assess because there were so many other factors going on, like big changes, like even just St. Paul Island right around that time, the socio-legal status that they were going through in relation to the U.S. government. And so it is going to be hard to say that there's one single cause. So yeah, I am not a statistician. At this point, I just say, well, we know that the suicide risk increases the further west you go in a time zone, the further displaced you are. It seems to me that any step that we can take to reduce that displacement would be to the benefit of Alaskans. Having said that, there are a variety of reasons why people have a preference for one or the other. It seems clear to me that much of the state agrees that ending the clock switch is important. If you want to know where I stand personally, it is only useful if we eliminate daylight savings time and don't try to change the time zone. Any conversation about displacing us further is worse.
And displacing us further would be going to permanent daylight saving time, which means like that we would spring forward and never spring back.
Exactly. And people aren't understanding that. People are like, oh, that's wonderful. No, it's not. It means that your mornings would be even darker because what it would affect is those months in the winter.
And I just want to say that I was a co-sponsor, Representative Jamie Allard's House Bill number 41, which would have put us on permanent daylight saving time. And I want to give my justification because people said, well, yeah, we want to have more light in the evening so that we can go on bike rides and do stuff outside. And I didn't think about it. This data that you've presented today, I never thought about this. And so I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's stick on one time zone and we'll keep more light in the evening and it'll be great. But you've convinced me. I'm going to take my name off of that. Now there's 2 other bills moving through the legislature.
So Senate Bill 102 would have exempted us from daylight savings time. That is a decision that we can make as a state.
Okay.
Senator Merrick's bill, again, petitions to make Alaska daylight time permanent. And it would only take effect. It's a conditional effect. It would only take effect if the Department of Transportation made that decision.
Got it. So basically, what her bill is saying is we're going to change our time zone to Pacific, basically.
So the bills that work, that would be effective at eliminating daylight saving time and making permanent standard time permanent in Alaska, that is a state level decision. It's similar to what Arizona, Hawaii, and the territories have done. There are 2 bills. In the Senate, it was 102, and by passing 26 out, that's kind of
Got it.
kills
So
it.
that's the one we want. We want Kawasaki's. Got it. Okay.
And then, but the House bill has a similar one. I think it was Kai Holland.
Yeah, 229.
Yes, 229. And so those are the 2 bills that I am in favor of.
Okay. So 102, Senate Bill 102 and House Bill 229
Yes, those
are
are
the
similar.
better bills.
Yes, yes.
But having had this conversation with you today, really, we need to go back to 4 time zones. If we really wanted to take public health as our priority. We need 4 time zones, not one unified time zone for the state of Alaska, which is better for commerce, but not better for public health.
Sure, I would love that. Is that a battle I'm going to fight? No, it's not going to happen in that I can see. Now, I've heard other kinds of discussions, and that is around making like a coordinated universal time, something like that. All of the time zone history is all about transportation. It was about the railroads.
Right.
Because historically, people didn't even want to do the 1 hour thing because they adjusted their things by the minute, 20 minutes.
Depending on where you were.
They really
And,
did.
and we have examples of
Fast
that. India is 30 minutes ahead.
Mhm.
Nepal is a 15-minute time zone. So
Yeah.
there are examples internationally
Absolutely.
of
Right.
doing more exact time zones.
And so if we were able to, as a society, sort of wrap our head around a coordinated universal time and then really and truly set local activities based on local needs, that'd be fantastic. But we can't even get the metric system. So
Right. Well, and
Yeah.
I guess the solution from your perspective might be an awareness in Western Alaska that this is happening. We can't change the time zone, but we can change start times. We can change how our business hours. A business could say, well, we're open from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m.,
Yeah.
which corresponds with sun rather than being open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or whatever.
And so, like if you're thinking about future strategies and tactics within Alaska, what I would love to see happen, and that might be realistic, and it would be probably more community by community or state level mandate, which again is difficult, is the school districts, if they have people who are local and understand this history, might be more receptive to, we really need to shift everything later.
Yes.
Everything later.
Yes.
And one thought I had is, state legislation that says, okay, no school will start before 8:30, which doesn't do a lot some places, but some places it does do something. I think Alaska is a state that has a very hard time accepting legislative mandates. To my mind, this is sort of akin to seatbelt laws and vaccine mandates, but even those have become controversial. And so,
Right.
So I, hoping that there comes a day where those are no longer controversial items. But I think that this kind of fits in that category, is that when we disrupt time zones, we disrupt sleep, and that affects everything.
I grew up in Texas, Central Time Zone, right in the heart of Central Time Zone. And I always was a morning person. I went to bed early and I got up early. And that has been thrown off during my years in Alaska.
Yes.
I tend to go to bed later and wake up later.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a shift in me.
It's not. No, and the more I thought about this at a personal level, I had a year in high school where I got up 3 days a week for a 7:30 a.m. class. And I look back at my own mental health. That was the most difficult emotional year of high school. And now I go, oh, no wonder. I
You were
was
sleep
so
deprived.
tired.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember trying so hard to go to sleep. And I couldn't get to sleep
the
before
way
11
I treat my
at
own
night.
child, because
Yeah.
I'm always screaming, about like, go to bed,
But
and
they
it's
can't.
not their fault.
I had the privilege of going and doing psychiatry in Dillingham. So I had some great conversations with clinicians and patients there about this whole issue. And, one of the things that I heard from a mom is in May, when their kids are still in school in April and May, and they've had daylight savings time, I can't get them to come in to go to bed. And so then they can't learn anything.
I know.
So is that why we have this bizarre schedule where we let the kids out in May? Because we can't get them to do anything because it's so light, so late, which is artificially so because of the time zone.
Right. That's interesting. I've heard it anecdotally, and I don't know if you know the data, that we have more divorces in the summer.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that when we look at, I think about suicide because it's the extreme marker for mental health distress. So when we look at what happens with mental health in Alaska, spring is the hardest. And people always find that counterintuitive. But if you look at it from a time zone perspective and a light perspective, it's not. Light is increasing rapidly. You have the time zone
You
change.
spring forward.
So you've got massive amounts of sleep deprivation going on. And I think that's a pretty significant factor. And
That's
it's
so
not.
interesting.
It has been overlooked.
Well, Lisa, Alexia, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I do ask people at the end if they have a book they want to recommend. Do you have a book you want to recommend?
Let's see here. I am actually just reading this one, and the first chapter's already got me quite engaged. A friend of mine from UAA lent me Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents. Isabel Wilkerson wrote The Warmth of Other Suns. And
I've heard of this book. It was
Yeah.
it was controversial, at the time that it came out, because I believe she talked about three different societies. I think Nazi Germany, she talked about India, and she talked about I think obviously
The U.S.
The US.
Yeah.
And in that context, I have not read it, but I've heard really good things.
Yeah. I took some pictures of a dozen other books. I usually have about 25 books in my to be read pile. So I anticipating this question, I'm like, what am I going to bring in? Well, this is the book that I'm like if I
Starting
say this,
now.
then I'm going to actually read it, right?
Well, In the Warmth of Other
Yeah.
Suns, have you read that book?
I haven't. I have it on my shelf.
I have it on my shelf too.
It's in the next 25.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks again for being on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I have dropped a link in the show notes to our guest editorial in the ADN about ending daylight saving time. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.